Okay, you're on.
All right.
That'll go away in a second.
Hey everybody, I'm Addison Herron. I wrote Wicked Woman, Women in Metal from the 1960s to now. Sarah was one of the first people she was the first person who expressed interest in the book that wasn't a friend I already knew or a family member. So it's very awesome to be here after that. So I'm going to be reading a little bit from my book because I feel like the way that I said it in my book is much more concise than the way I would say it now, since I'm a much better writer and speaker. But when I first wrote Wicked Woman, it was because I was so interested in James Dawson and Coven, who were actually mentioned in the first presentation earlier today. Because they were one of the first metal bands ever, and they had a woman in the band, and they have such an interesting story, I kind of felt like that really needed to be shared. So I'm going to read a little from my first chapter, which is called James Dawson and the Goddess Tradition, The Rise of Heavy Metal. Trained in opera as well as the occult, James considered herself a professional musician as well as a ceremonial magician of the left-hand path at an early age. While still in her teens, she decided to combine her love of music with her love of mysticism to start a rock band that would showcase her impressive voice and her occult beliefs. I came up with the name Coven because I had done extensive reading on the occult and loved classic horror films, she told Steve Kaufman of Steve Kaufman Music Forums. I was very interested in the paranormal, secret societies, the black art, and I knew the name Coven meant a band of 13 witches. Remember, I was doing this at the tail end of the peace, love, hippie years, and the mood of the country at the time was getting darker and more chaotic, with assassinations, rioting against Vietnam and such, so I thought people would be interested in the ideas I was into. And with my opera background, I wanted to put these ideas into the music to do a kind of gothic rock opera theater, something no one had done before. James recruited bassist Oz Osborne, guitarist Chris Nielsen, Rick Durrett on keyboards, and drummer Stephen Ross to form Coven in the late 1960s. The date of the band's formation is often given as 1968 or 69, but they were actually popular before that in their hometowns, opening for groups like Vanilla Fudge, the Yardbirds, and Alice Cooper. And their first album was Witchcraft Destroys Minds and Reaps Souls, which was from Mercury Records, which was pretty big at the time. Apparently they signed their contracts with their own blood. I don't know if that's a story they tell or if it's true. But the album was overtly satanic, filled with songs about witches and devils, including Wicked Woman, co-written by James, For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge, Black Sabbath, Dignitaries of Hell, and Satanic Mass, which is actually a 13-minute long recording of the Satanic Mass. At her concerts, James presided in a long cloak, throwing it off dramatically, she transformed from high priestess to rock singer. Her persona was part sorceress, part temptress, and her look was all contrast. Black eye makeup on pale skin and long blonde hair on black velvet robes. A look that was both scary and sexy. However, the woman shown lying naked on the inside cover of Witchcraft Destroys Minds and Reaps Souls is not her, as one of the myths would have it, but a lookalike blonde. So for a brief period after the album's release, Coven was gaining sales, they were gaining popularity and notoriety. And when they performed, they would usually draw not only fans but protesters, hecklers, and even the police presence. In Detroit, James was actually arrested. Apparently they had to run through their entire performance before the show. And that she was told she couldn't speak any English during the show, she could only run through the songs. At one point she said, "Happy All Hallows Eve, Detroit," and for that she was arrested. So whether despite or because of their unconventional attitude and occult leanings, they seemed headed for success. They're a mixture of devil worship and psychedelia, which is much like what Black Sabbath was to gain their success. Seemed like something that was gaining popularity at the time. And if not for the murders committed by followers of Charles Manson, that was talked about in the March 1970 issue of Esquire, they might have had this success on their own terms. The theme of this issue of Esquire was Evil Lurks in California. It contains one large article about the infamous Swan Ranch, last home of the Manson family, along with other accounts and photographs of the questionable doings of Californians. In the middle of a minor story, not even in the Manson article, a brief anonymous man on the street in California said, "Have you heard this new album? It's called Witchcraft Destroys Minds and Reaps Souls. It says on the jacket, full of black mass stuff." This started a bunch of rumors that ended up tying Esquire and Manson and Coven all together. If you look it up online today, a lot of people think that it was a picture of Charles Manson holding the Coven record. This is not true. No such picture exists, and there's no evidence that Charles Manson was a fan. But when that happened, Mercury Records actually decided they couldn't deal with all the bad press. They were already too controversial, and this was the last straw, so they dropped Coven. After that, no one would touch them. They recorded a few more songs, but no one was really interested in signing them. They lost a lot of popularity, and as with so many bands from that time, like Diamond Head, they lost all the rights. They didn't have the rights to their music. They didn't understand the contract that they signed when Jinx was literally 18, 19, and they didn't have rights to their music. But basically what I pose in this book is that witchy aesthetic, that female power and occult aesthetic in metal has survived. It's still a really prevalent part of metal, and it's not going away, even though Jinx may not be remembered for the kind of household name that Ozzy Osbourne obviously is to many people. So I'm just going to read this short passage that I wrote about Doom and kind of the connections I see between Doom and what Jinx was doing. In the early years of the 21st century, women became inspired by the music of Coven, the Third and Immortal, which is another early Doom band, if you remember, and by many all-male Doom bands, to form a subgenre of their own, which has come to be known as female-fronted Doom metal. And there's many examples of women in Doom. One obvious one that comes to mind off the top of my head a lot is Windhand, with their strong female presence. With Electric Wizard, even though Liz is not the vocalist, they're a very witchy band. She's very much one of the front members of the band. So you see a lot of that female presence in Doom. So overall, women in the Doom scene seem to have more agency than in other subgenres in the history of metal. In this arena, women can sing, but they can also play guitar. Similarly, a band can have a name with witch in the title and play earth-centric music, or they can go without that, and they don't have to play earth-centric music. Women have the creative control not only to write music and lyrics, but to choose the band's image and message as well. As it was with Jinx Dawson and Coven in the beginning, in today's Doom bands, the founders and leaders are often female members of the bands. Although some gender issues in the Doom scene are still unresolved, it seems to be one of the more comfortable and nurturing scenes for women in metal thus far. The women in Doom are thriving, and their numbers are growing every day. And then one of the texts that I touch on a lot in this book is Music and Women, a book by Sophie Drinker. And Sophie Drinker was an interesting figure. I believe it was in the 1920s. She was actually an aristocrat. She had a rich husband, and so she just had a lot of time to dedicate to her own scholarship, which a lot of women didn't have. And she wrote an amazing book called Music and Women, which talks about the tie between women, the occult, the goddess tradition, and music. In it, she discusses her belief that women will regain their rightful place in society as healers, guides, and musicians, using their experience as females, the good and the bad, to help define their art. They must find rituals and music to reinforce their own spirits in the crisis of womanhood, she writes, and they must have representation in the larger life of the community with the authority of the natural woman. Then can the daughters of women proceed boldly and confidently to the task of objectifying their experiences in whatever way they find opportunity and incentive. And then just to kind of show that this isn't only a phenomenon within Doom and Proto-Doom, because as we all know, a lot of Doom bands are trying to capture the aesthetic of the 60s and 70s and Black Sabbath. That's what they're going for, so clearly it's intentional. This has also been seen throughout metal's history, even in the more unlikely format of thrash, which I felt was appropriate to bring for this conference. So this is from the chapter on thrash, entitled Princesses of Hell, Women in Glam, Speed, and Thrash. Although thrash didn't have the same amount of female participation as the early punk scene, there were definitely more women in the audience of thrash shows, and more than just a few of the musicians that came up to the sport were female. A premier representative of female thrash is Anne Boleyn, outspoken frontwoman of Hellion, a Los Angeles thrash band. She did a short stint at the Runaways, as well as a few other less successful girl groups in the late 70s, and also landed a gig with KROQ-FM radio station in Los Angeles, hosting a show that featured metal and punk bands. As the playlist began to focus more on new metal music, it was christened Speed Metal Hell, which is a term that Boleyn herself came up with to describe the faster, more aggressive brand of metal. So she, in essence, coined the term speed metal. She joined Hellion in 1982 as a keyboardist, but when a suitable lead singer for the band failed to materialize, she and guitarist Ray Schneck shared vocals. She made no secret of her interest in witchcraft and the occult, supposedly leading to the abrupt departure of original bassist Katie Tuffield that same year. Like Jinx Dawson of Coven, Anne claims family connection to the dark side. In a 2002 interview, she said that her grandfather, a doctor, was a friend of Aleister Crowley, and that her grandfather taught her to use divine rod when she was still a child. When I was 18, I worked with Dr. John Brooker, who was doing government-sponsored experiments in out-of-body travel. She told all of us her hard music. In the Hellion song Break the Spell, I say magic is the power of the science and the mind. Have I practiced magic? Absolutely. It is my religion. So you see a lot of women throughout the history of metal that have taken a more powerful role, have kind of taken in this aesthetic. They've kind of embraced this otherness and this witchiness that can so often be seen as negative in our society, and said, okay, well, that's going to be our thing as a counterculture woman, as a woman in metal. I'm going to really embrace this aesthetic. And that's mostly what I was interested in, and that's pretty much what this book is on. Pretty much the thesis of this book.
Comments or questions?
Thank you very much. Really interesting. Do you think from the stuff that you've done with the book, that there's a necessity for women in metal to create themselves quite specific ideas, like this is the thing I'm going to embrace, because they aren't necessarily just going to be able to be like the guitarist, because they're always going to be the girl guitarist, and that's the language that we hear all the time, or the female band, or female fronted band. Nobody ever goes the male fronted band.
Exactly.
Right. So, do you think there's a necessity for women to kind of create more of an identity for themselves, quite specific, that they can describe, because that gives them a kind of right, I can say who I am, whereas guys get away with just kind of bumbling through a bit.
Yeah, I definitely think so. Yeah, I think that's a little unfortunate, and it's one of the things I've dealt with, and definitely one of the criticisms that I've gotten is that, well, you're actually drawing more attention to this as an issue if you just let women in metal be women and just pretend that they're just like the men, then it'll be more accepted. But like anywhere else in society, unfortunately, women are not just like the men. They are always going to be the token woman. So yes, I think by taking on this kind of stronger persona, this does allow women in heavy metal to say, well, we have a thing too, like this is our source of power, this is our female source of energy.
Aside from an obvious historical connection, do you think there's anything else about what you're able to do that make it more acceptable or more appealing for women? Because I've noticed a lot of that too, like different subgenres happen more or less.
Yeah, I definitely think a lot of it has to do with the aesthetic. A lot of Doom always had to do with, almost because it did come out of the hippie tradition, the more earth-centered things, paganism, magic, ritual, things like that, are a lot of times the topics in Doom, whereas in something like death metal, where it does feel a little bit more testosterone-fueled, even though there's definitely a great female presence. Yeah, I think just the sort of subject matter and imagery calls to women a little bit more.
Do you find that within the Doom community there's an awareness of Covenant in terms of sort of see Jinx as a founding mother, as it were, or is it more that you're drawing attention?
There's somewhat of it. I've also encountered a lot of people who hate Coven. They just think their music is really bad. I personally think it's good. Some of those early bands that didn't get popular alongside Black Sabbath, I would argue they just kind of don't have it. You can see that they're not as catchy as Black Sabbath. They didn't really have that. But what I argue with Coven is that they did. They have. Their songs are so catchy and so much they stick in your head that they did have the ability to be like the Black Sabbath, Paranoid, Iron Man songs that we hear on the radio today.
I'm really looking forward to reading your book, and I just wanted to ask you a little bit about how you dug up this information, about your process of doing the research for this book, because it's not just easily out there in the published sources. So I just wanted to know more about your process.
Sure. Well, I actually had to do a paper for undergraduate. It was just this women in music class that I took because I needed a women's studies credit and it looked interesting. We picked a genre to write about women in that genre, so of course I picked metal because that's what I was interested in. And when I read the story of Coven, I was like, oh my gosh, how has someone not turned this into a book? And I think, in fairness, I think she has, been a biographer herself. But I was like, this is such an interesting story. So then I started doing more research on her, and I sort of started seeing the connections to the Doom scene. I just started doing more research, and a lot of it is more of me drawing academic sort of comparisons between them, finding women who also thought that and using their quotes. But yeah, for the most part, it was doing research. And Jinx is actually very vocal about her participation in the metal scene. She's done a bunch of interviews and she answers questions on Facebook. She's very active, so that made her a lot of
You mentioned that, I think it was the first Coven album has a version of the Black Mass on it.
Yes.
Which version?
Of which version of the album or which version of a Black Man?
Which version of the Black Mass?
That I don't know enough about the scholarship of Black Man.
Okay.
But it would be very interesting to find out. So I'll have to look into that for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, it's very cool. I'm not sure. I know there's more in my book. And if you read it, talks about the tradition she comes out of. She had a Creole nanny who she learned magic from, and I think she kind of pulls from a variety of traditions. So it could have been, I'm guessing, something that she sort of developed herself.
If I may ask her, I read about that, and Hold of That Black Mass was written by them and their producer.
Oh,
Okay.
cool. Awesome. Anyone else?
Thank you. So we have fellow Zaffaroni next, so give us a few minutes to set up. At the meantime, we have
Let me know when it's